Expedition 44 here with Dr. Ryan and Dr. Matt. We've got a guest that we will introduce you to in just a second. We have been on the what seems to be never-ending series on the church, going through our normal Expedition 44 way of not leaving a rock unturned, kind of starting off with what does the Bible actually say, and more into exegesis than just about anything else. So welcome to the next episode. We are going to sort of take a little bit of a break on our normal church series, and our last episode was on the shepherd teacher, and so we thought it would be very fitting to have one of our favorite shepherd teachers in the entire world on to kind of share a little bit about his life and his community and everything has going. Matt, can you tell us a little bit about our guest today?
Yeah, we're super excited to have Brian Zahnd on today. He is the founder and lead pastor of Word of Life Church in St. Joseph, Missouri. It's a non-denominational congregation there. Brian and his wife, Peri, founded that church in 1981. And Brian is author of several books, including Sinners in the Hands of a Loving God, Water to Wine, A Farewell to Mars, Beauty Will Save the World, and Unconditional, the Call of Jesus to Radical Forgiveness. So, Brian, we're so excited to have you on and for this conversation. Personally, I consider you a pastor that I follow and someone who has pastored me through a lot of theological journey in my own life. And I've gone through your prayer school, which hopefully we'll talk about a little later. But I've just been so appreciative of your pastoral ministry. It's been an big impact on my life. So thanks for coming on. We're really happy and excited to talk with you today.
Thank you, Matt.
So can you share a little bit with us about maybe some of your story, maybe how you came to Jesus and got into ministry?
I'm a Jesus freak. That's what I am. I came to Jesus, or Jesus crashed into my life in the 1970s when I was 16 years old. I'm 64 now, so I don't make any secrets about that, so you know how long I've been doing this. And it was a very dramatic conversion. I don't think all conversions need to be like that, not most, but for whatever reason it was. And I just sort of overnight, I mean, it was radical and sudden. And I went from being the high school Led Zeppelin freak to the high school Jesus freak, just like that, although I still like Zeppelin. But so by the time I was 17, I was leading a ministry. This is during the Jesus movement. People may be familiar with that, may not, I don't know. But the Jesus movement was really more centered around music than anything else. And you would have these, they called them coffee houses, but they were really just music venues. And by the time I was 17, I was leading a ministry here in St. Joseph called the Catacombs. We met in several locations, but our first location was the basement of a dive bar on 3rd Street. So Catacombs, you know, double entendre, because we had an affinity with, you know, the early church and their catacombs, but we were also literally subterranean. We're in this basement. And so I'm leading a ministry a year after having come to Jesus that they just turned into a church. I don't recommend these things. You know, this isn't the way to do it. You, in the introduction, you said I'm non-denominational. I am. I don't think that's really a good idea, but it's just what happened. I just got caught up in something. And so by the time I was 22, this is November of 1981, we went from being the Catacombs to actually being a church, Word of Life Church. So, you know, it's what I've done with my life for going on 42 years. But I was actually doing the work of a pastor, essentially, for about 5 years before I was officially the pastor. So I tell people, look, I've been a pastor longer than I've been an adult. And I do laugh every time I say that. It's just the absurdity of it, right? I mean, it's absurd, but it's what happened. And so the church, we were small, you know, it was a small church until it wasn't a small church. And as we entered the 90s, for whatever reason, and I have maybe some idea of why it happened, other in some things I just don't know, but we grew enormously. We grew from like under 100 to building and moving into a 2,000 seat sanctuary in 7 years. That's amazing to me. And that was fun. I mean, it was exciting. I mean, if you've ever been, in leadership in a church and like every Sunday is record attendance for several years, that's a lot of fun. That was a wild ride and I enjoyed it. But as I entered my 40s, so a lot of time's going by, right? I began to be increasingly discontented. I mean, somebody could say, well, it's just a midlife crisis. I don't know. We'll call it what you will. But by all of the metrics that Americans like to measure success in ministry, man, we had it made. Everything's going great. There's no problem. The church is doing well. The church is growing. The church is large. The church has a big budget and all of that. And it's just great. Except I was increasingly discontented. And I began to feel like Jesus deserved a better Christianity than what I actually knew. And so, because it began to feel too commercial, too compromised, too American, maybe I'll say that. And I didn't know what to do, actually, because I just always done the best I could. I was just a Jesus freak that accidentally ended up as a pastor. That's pretty accurate. And so I thought, well, what do I do? And so I decided I would back up as far as I could. I knew you've been talking about the church. I backed up. I mean, I knew the scriptures fairly well, at least the text, And so I thought, well, I'm going to start reading the earliest Christian theology, patristics, the church fathers. And I just started with, the very early ones, Clement, Polycarp, people like that, and just worked my way up, Irenaeus eventually, and Athanasius, all those guys. Because I just thought, well, it seems like we've got off track somewhere. And so I'm reading a lot of, this is like when I'm 45, like 2004, almost 20 years ago. And so I began to read church fathers and philosophy. I'd always kind of liked philosophy, but in the world I was in, because we were essentially by that time kind of just a charismatic word of faith church. And I don't know if you know this, most charismatic word of faith pastors do not read philosophy. I don't know if you knew that. but I'd always liked it. And so I was reading philosophy and patristics. That's great. It was good. It was sort of recalibrating me. And yet I said it this way, I was just embarrassingly ignorant of the good stuff that was contemporary anyway. I was reading church father, that's great, but you're reading stuff that's, 1,500 years old or so. And I thought, well, I need something more contemporary. And I just didn't know, because if you don't know, you don't know, right? And I prayed one day. I said, God, show me what to read. I was here in my house, and I'd prayed it, sort of a frustrated prayer. God, show me what to read. And 5 minutes later, my wife, Peri, walks in the room, walks up to me, hands me a book and says, here, I think you should read this. She had no idea what I'd prayed. That was one of those, ooh, give you shivers sort of thing. And, but it gets stranger. Peri had not read this book. It gets stranger. Peri just found it in our house. To this day, we do not know exactly how this book got in our house. I didn't buy it. She didn't buy it. Somehow it was here. And she found it, looked at the title, looked at the back, said, Brian might like this. She brought it to me. I started reading it the next day when I was on a flight somewhere. And it was like a door was kicked open in my mind. And things began to change fast. And the book, I know, what was the book? The Divine Conspiracy by Dallas Willard. And you know how one thing leads to another. So I find Dallas Willard. There it is. That's it. Book changed my life. It changed my life, not just the book itself, but it opened a door to a whole world that hitherto I did not know existed. And what I would do is I would just sort of binge read various authors. So I read pretty much all Dallas Willard, and then I think about next up was N.T. Wright, and I pretty much read all of his stuff, and that's no small feat.
Oh yeah.
He writes it. He writes as fast as most of us read anyway, so it's hard just to keep up. And but I did, and then I got into a lot of Hauerwas, a lot of. I did not read all of Barth. Okay, I didn't read all of Barth, but I read a lot of Barth, and so that gives you an idea. So this is the kind of Brueggemann. I read a lot of Brueggemann. And you can imagine, just imagine Word of Life Church 20 years ago, charismatic, non-denominational, sort of word of faith, megachurch. And the pastor's reading serious academic theology. I'm reading it 5 or 6 hours a night. And never did it seem like it was work. It was always like I'd struck gold and couldn't pull it out of the ground fast enough. I was like, where have you been all my life? Of course, this is going to change a pastor. And it did change me. And my sermons changed. And I think the church mostly could have gone along with the changes I was making until I began to be critical of the American empire. And began to preach that there was no easy alliance between the kingdom of Jesus Christ and the empire that is America. And that caused us to lose probably 1,500 people.
Wow.
And I'm in a town of 70,000, so I'm not in a big city. If you lose 1,500 people in a town of 70,000, what does that mean? It means a lot of things, but it means this. It means when you go to the grocery store, you see them. And it was, and my wife was with me, in this journey. I wasn't bringing her along. We were just together. We were together. And we look back on that time 20 years ago, and it really was. It's Dickens. It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. It was the best of times because what we were finding is really, in many ways, what we've been looking for since the days of the Jesus movement. And we were thrilled and excited, but people were leaving and saying mean things about us. And these were not to us just nameless faces. These were people that we had loved and known, maybe led to the Lord, baptized their kids, married their kids, and they were leaving. And it was so painful. And I write about it in Water to Wine, but looking back on it now, I was still feeling a lot of pain when I wrote Water to Wine. That's the book that tells this story. And I think I softened it. I think it was actually more painful than I let on. And, but I also want people to know, because I don't want people just feeling sorry for me. We're fine now. We're fine. We've come through it. We're well. We're okay. The church survived. It was touch and go. I didn't know if it was going to or not, but it did. And we're in a good place and we're happy. But that's, in a nutshell, that's my story. I'm leaving out so much, but the idea would be, I guess, that in my mid-40s, I was born again. I've had 2 conversions, and they were equally dramatic. I mentioned the very dramatic conversion as a 16-year-old kid, and then as a 45-year-old man, there was a second conversion that was as dramatic and radical as the first. And both times, those conversions happened when I was verging on danger. As a 16-year-old, I was headed for trouble. I could see where I was headed, and it was going to be, bad. And Jesus saved me. And then at 45, Jesus saved me again. Not from, I wouldn't have gone down the self-destructive path that I was headed for as a teenager. It was a different kind of, I was turning in, instead of a Jesus freak, I was going to turn into a Republican or something. I'm not saying there's anything necessarily wrong with being a Republican. I'm just saying I didn't want to just turn into, from a Jesus freak to a petulant Republican with a Jesus fish on his SUV. Right? I wanted to stay radical. I wanted to have that kingdom sense that we are involved in something that is actually capable of turning the world upside down.
Yeah.
And so, okay, I've rambled quite a while, but that'll give you an idea of where I'm coming from.
I love where you've been going, and you mentioned this book, and this is I've read quite a few of yours, but this is actually one of my all-time favorites. And the reason is you hit on a lot of different things here. One of the guys that teaches at CTS with Matt and I, his name is Steve Castle, and he's kind of your patriotic American. And Matt and I go back and forth with him all the time. In fact, he's been on our channel all the time having, little friendly debates and things like that. Matt and I, if you don't know, are really into just Jesus kingdom thinking completely. I mean, to the point that like we would say, if you're dabbling in anything else, you're in the wrong kingdom, and so we love that about you. That's one of the things that really led us to love all of your work. So it's the way that you think that way. And I mean, we might even, I know writing is different sometimes than what you conceptually theorize, but we're with you, and then maybe even then some, just so you know. And so we love what you wrote there. I also really like the transparency that you're getting into, because I really believe, and this is one thing that we try to overcome in the early days of having a student at Covenant Theological Seminary, is that we find that there's a lot of preachers, teachers, pastors that sort of know of God and teach and preach about God and things like that. But when it comes to really having an incredible, faithful, lifelong, allegiant, amazing relationship with him, that every day they get up and they say, God, what am I going to do for your kingdom here? There aren't a lot of people and even pastors that live that way. And I think that's when I go back to this book, that's what really drew me in there. Now, I know we're not interviewing you today for your book, but I like this one. I like so many of yours, but I talk about this one because where we are in our series is on the church. And we've been asking the questions, what's wrong with the church? And boy, if I had to pick one major thing that I could say is wrong with the church, I would say that the church hardly knows God these days. They hardly have the transparency with the Lord. And I think that that's one of the things that you sort of bring out in that book. And then several of your books since is kind of putting it on the line of, are you really living the kind of life that looks like you're wholly and completely devoted to the Lord? Or are you more driven by your job or your commercialism or, whatever else it might be? You've already spoken to that pretty well, but can you just expound a little bit on, maybe your current feelings and, where you're at maybe 20 years later after the book and with your church on that road?
Karl Barth said, God cannot serve, God can only rule. Now, I have to unpack this a little bit. He said it in the context of political theology in Germany in the 1930s with the rise of the Nazi Party, which was by and large supported by the Protestant church in Germany, because you had the German Christian movement. And what Barth is saying, he's not saying that God cannot be humble and revealed as a servant in Christ. He doesn't mean it. He means God cannot serve some other agenda.
Yeah.
God has his own kingdom. And what I've seen increasingly in America is, and this is not purely a critique of what we would call the Christian right. This is equally applicable to the Christian left. They end up serving a political agenda with Jesus trotted out as the mascot, as an endorser. See, the problem with both Christian right and Christian left is that Christian gets reduced to adjective duty. What really matters is the all-important political noun, right or left. And the truth is, Jesus will have nothing to do with that. Jesus is Lord. And so I am not trying to find a way for Jesus to serve some political agenda, political party. That is, look, when Christianity without transcendence degenerates into politics. And so I'm emphasizing the transcendence of the risen Christ and actually knowing him, actually having experience with him. This was the energy of the early church, that Jesus was alive and present in their midst. Yes, sacrament. Yes, as they gathered together, 2 or more gathered in my name, I'm there. But it was a palpable energy, a sense that Jesus was present, and that's who they were following and serving. There was an element of that in the early Jesus movement, the 1970s, that I've always thought, as I've become fairly acquainted with church history and read lots of books on this, at times I go, that reminds me of the Jesus movement in the 70s. We were like that, with an emphasis on communal lifestyle, humility, a real de-emphasis on materialism and possession and that sort of thing. And there was just this energy that Jesus is alive, present, active among us, and our task is to serve him. So that's what I'm trying to recover. I mean, that's what I'm advocating. That's what I'm trying to model. I don't even remember what the question was, but you can jump in and bail me out.
How does so you mentioned it was hard at first and your church went down by 1,500 people and you had to work through that. Did your church ever come back up in numbers? Did you decide
it's coming back, but
micro church, like, where did you land?
As Dylan says in one of his songs, you can always come back, but you can't come back all the way. maybe we will, but I don't know. But I'll tell you something else. I'll answer that question. I'll come back to that. But let me just say this very sincerely. The energy I had for church growth in my 30s, I don't have that anymore. That might be a stage of life thing, but it also might be, it's just not that important to me.
Yeah.
Just to build a big church, to have a big church, that doesn't appeal to me anymore. We're a very healthy church and it's growing and we're doing fine. But when 1,500 people left, they were the 1,500 people that had money. So, that made it hard. We had this phenomenon. This is very interesting. This is telling. We had the phenomenon, because, by this time we'd been around for a good long while, 20, 25 years. And we had the phenomenon of people that would be my peer age, maybe older, leaving the church and their adult children staying. Mm-hmm. Their adult children saying, Mom, Dad, you can do what you want, but we're staying. It's a church like this that's keeping us in Christianity at all. And so ultimately I thought, okay, that's a good sign that those that are leaving are the older ones and the younger people are staying. But here's what I found out about these younger millennial people. Either A, they don't have any money, or B, they don't like to give it.
Yeah.
So we had to, that was hard, but we made it through and we're okay now. We're okay. But it was, I don't want people to misunderstand. It sounds like that the money was the thing. No, that wasn't the thing. I mean, it created pressure. That's real pressure, by the way. But it was just the pain of being misunderstood.
Yeah.
People would say, they would say things like, Pastor Brian's backslidden. I thought, backslidden? Backslidden? I feel like I've sprinted forward. I feel like I'm more passionate about Jesus than I've ever been, But I also found that I remember losing people during I can't remember how long. It was 6 months. 6 months. It was exactly 6 months. 26 weeks. I preached a 26-week series through the Sermon on the Mount. And I was really trying my best just to let Jesus say what he wants to say. Yeah. And I'm telling you, Sunday after Sunday, people would come up to me and they'd say, are you saying, and thus and so, something that they were, disagreeing with. And I would say, I'm really trying not to say anything. I'm trying to let Jesus say what he says. What do you think? And I think it was just too much cognitive dissonance for them to say, I'm disagreeing with Jesus. So they had to cast it in their mind as I'm disagreeing with Brian. Right. I literally had a guy, and he was a faithful church member. I see him now and then. We're still friends, but he left. He's a smart guy, business guy. He came up to me one day and he said, yeah, I know turn the cheek, but the Bible says an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. And I just stared at him like, Jesus said, you've heard it said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, but I say unto you, do not resist the one who is evil. And I think he just could not imagine that he was disagreeing with Jesus, but he was. And so that was an interesting experience, but it created a lot of pain. And I can tell you when we were healed. It took probably 10 years to really transition the church. The pastors that are listening are going to be terrified when they hear this, but it took 10 years. From about 2004 to 2014. By 2014, we were more or less what we are today, and we were okay. But Peri and I were still wounded. And I tell you what, you wouldn't have known it. We put on a brave face, and we didn't get bitter, and we didn't act mean or blame or any of that, but we were hurt. And we stayed hurt for 2 more years until in 2016, for the first time, we walked the Camino de Santiago. This is this 500, well, if you go the Francais route, it's 500 miles from Saint-Jean-Pied-de-Port, France, to Santiago de Compostela, Spain, on this 1,200-year-old pilgrim path, carrying all our stuff on our back. You know, it's a 40-day, 500-mile walk for us. And I don't know how to say it other than just to say it. We began that walk on September 16th, Holy Cross Day, September 16th, 2016. And 40 days later, when we arrived in Santiago after walking that 500 miles, we were well. Our souls were healed. And I don't know, and if Peri were here, she would just say, absolutely, that happened. And by the way, it was, because I know that you get probably some pastors, that was our first significant break we'd ever had. Well, we would take vacations where I'd miss one Sunday, but I had not missed more than one Sunday preaching at that point, whatever it was, for 35 years. 35. For 35 years, I never missed. I'm not proud of that. I'm just telling you what I did. I never went more than one Sunday without preaching for 35 years. And then we took off 7 weeks and walked across Spain, and we were healed. Isn't that amazing?
That's so good. Yeah, I've loved hearing your stories about the Camino there. Let's change gears just a little bit and talk about, you have a book called When Everything's on Fire, where you kind of address deconstruction, and kind of that's a very hot topic in the church today. So and you address it in such a pastoral way. It's really great how you can keep Jesus and get rid of the bad theology. So talk to us a little bit about deconstruction, reconstruction, and especially how it like relates to fundamentalism and like secularism.
Yeah. Well, we've landed on the term deconstruction. I accept that. That's what we use. I'm not a fan of it. I mean, I have enough background in philosophy to understand where it comes from. Jacques Derrida and his application of deconstruction theory to texts. Okay, I get that. I wish we had come, because what I went through beginning in 2004, today people would probably classify that as, oh, Pastor Brian's in deconstruction. Although I would never have thought of it like that. I would not have used that language then. I would more like say, I'm in the process of recovering a beautiful piece of art. It's like, imagine that a ancient icon is found in some, Russian monastery somewhere. It's 1,000 years old. It's valuable, but it also has this patina of dirt and soot, and incense smoke, and whatever else that has nearly obscured the image. Let's say it's a Christ icon. It nearly obscured the image of Christ. Well, what do? Well, you try to restore it. And but the restoration artist, when they go to work, they're not using sledgehammers and dynamite.
Yeah.
They're using delicate brushes and mild solvents, and so, or I guess maybe my favorite metaphor is water to wine. I mean, in midlife, it felt like everything was pretty thin and weak, and the party was beginning to get a little bit boring. And then Jesus showed up and did a miracle and turned the water to wine. And I found intoxicating Christianity once again. But I'm fine with deconstruction. I mean, it's not the term I would use, but Okay, we can use that term. What happens, though, is if you come from any kind of fundamentalist or fundamentalist leaning background, tends to tie everything together in one package, so that if you lose one part of your theology, the whole thing has to be thrown out.
Mm-hmm.
I see this phenomenon, and what I'm seeing people do is leave Christianity, but they remain a fundamentalist. And then they end up becoming like a fundamentalist atheist or a fundamentalist agnostic or a fundamentalist cynic or whatever it is, rather than, well, let's deconstruct the fundamentalism.
Mm-hmm.
And let's learn how to not hold on to Jesus and let everything else be loose, and let's work on some things. And so that's what the book is about. The book has a Camino connection, because we were walking the Francés route for the second time in 2019. And when you walking the Camino de Santiago is a little bit like a time machine, because you can sense an ancient past. Because so many of these churches, chapels, shrines, they're 1,000 years old, and you're seeing them every day and maybe entering them. And so I began to feel, I could feel an earlier epoch when Christian faith was generally assumed and assisted by the wider culture. Now, I don't want to over glorify the medieval period. I don't want to do that. But I acknowledge there was a time when society as a whole, more or less, helped people retain a basic Christian faith. And that time is long gone. And now I was leading a retreat recently for Benedictine nuns, of all things. And one of them said to me, one of the sisters said to me, she said, to hold on to faith in the age in which we live may be equivalent to the aesthetic feats of the saints of old. These great fasters, or someone would stand on a pillar for however long, that just to maintain faith in a cynical and secular age is a heroic act. Well, so I was thinking about this, and I was thinking, well, what would I say if someone that was beginning to waver, beginning maybe to doubt, beginning to question, can I worship a God that it purports in Scripture that he commanded what we would today call genocide? Yeah. I mean, that's just one example. That can be a trigger for people, right? You go, well, what am I doing? What kind of religion is this? And I just thought, well, if someone was beginning to question, beginning to have doubts, beginning to enter what we might call deconstruction, and we had a day or two to walk together on the Camino, how might our conversation go? That's what I've thought that for about 2 weeks walking. Because when you're walking 6 hours a day, you have a lot of time to think. That's part of the point of it. And finally, we got to a village, lovely Spanish hilltop village called Castro Jariz. And we got settled in, and I was sitting out on a patio, and I just had my little notebook, and I just outlined what became, I guess, the 11 chapters. I can't remember how many chapters that book has, of that book. And it really stayed pretty close to that. So I wrote it from, I would say, yes, a pastoral place. And I know this for sure. Trying to shame somebody or scold them for going through deconstruction, that ain't going to work. That's the least pastoral thing you can do, because what people are experiencing is a real phenomenon. And that's why I begin the book with Nietzsche, who I've read a lot of Nietzsche. I've read most of Nietzsche. And I like Nietzsche. Now, I disagree with him. Here's the thing you got to know about Nietzsche. He was a PK. He was a pastor's kid. And here's the thing about pastors' kids, PKs. I raised 3 of them. They see it all, and they are acutely attuned to hypocrisy. And much of what Nietzsche is lashing out at is really just kind of the state-sponsored Lutheran church that he knew. And it's the same thing that Soren Kierkegaard attacks. I mean, he calls it attack on Christendom, but Kierkegaard does it from a place of retaining faith, not rejecting faith. But anyway, Nietzsche is one that foresaw what we were entering. a time when we would begin to turn away from God. But unlike the kind of the cavalier new atheists, Nietzsche was not, he said this is a dangerous move. He said, because if we don't find something else, and he was for it, he thought that this is what should happen. But if we don't become the Ubermensch, the Overman, the Superman, and rise up in our greatness and all that, then all that remains is nihilism. And that is, belief in nothing, just sort of that life is without meaning or purpose. So I don't want to go into a bunch of philosophy, but the point is, what is happening is real. Or I think in the book I say, being angry at modern people for losing their faith is like being angry at medieval people for dying of the plague. I mean, something has happened, and what we need to do is not scold, not rebuke, not mock, but we need to help. We need to assist, and that's what I attempt to do in that book.
Yeah. So I hate to keep going back to covenant, but it ties so much into here, is that one of the things that we really, our main goal in each class is we try to present, what are the views on a different subject. And it's so funny how most of the time people that are in these classes are preachers, teachers. I mean, a lot of the church is in our classes, and they've never even heard a lot of the views that we're presenting, especially as a viable biblical consideration. And so first present the view, and then what we want to know when the students write is, do they understand the view? And then where do they land with this? And it's really interesting. I mean, you've been just pulling our heartstrings. Matt and I have just kind of been sitting going like this, because people call us theologians all the time. Oh, X44, those two theologians over there. And Matt and I really hate the word theology. And we really even hate the word apologetics even more. And I mean, CTS doesn't even, we refuse to have an apologetics department. I mean, we get people coming, oh, I want to go into apology, and nothing wrong with that. I have a few students that we're going to send to a different school to finish their, training, should they want to go that way. But it's tough words, and you kind of get into the literalistic fundamentalism that you've been talking about, and kind of land with, you really give all that up for the revelation of Jesus. It comes down to the word. Can you just kind of keep going with that a little bit and kind of clarify what you mean by that and why that's a better path?
Well, fundamentalism, first of all, is a modern reaction to empiricism. It's actually a modern cooperation with it. Fundamentalism and philosophical materialism are really just two sides of the same coin. And what happened was, with the rise of empiricism, that is the assumption that the whole of reality, the entire phenomenon of being, can be ascertained through the five physical senses and the amplification of them, which then precludes even the possibility of a what we would call a spiritual world, because that's not, you don't track that with the five physical senses. What happened then is, okay, then we'll take the same approach, the same methods of science, and apply it to the Bible, as if the Bible was the kind of book that could be studied that way. And that's where fundamentalism comes from. It's really an approach. It's a way of reading the scriptures and then trying to apply it to our life that ultimately doesn't work. I mean, some may go through life and it works for them, but the moment the cracks begin to appear, the whole edifice can come crashing down. So I say fundamentalism is filled with trapdoors dropping down into atheism. So our foundation is not a particular reading of scripture or even the Bible itself. Our foundation is Jesus Christ and our own experience with him, or maybe the more technical term might be revelation. This is the phenomenon that actually we're all familiar with, but we have been conditioned here in modernity to reject this. And that is that, well, I'll quote Blaise Pascal. He says, the heart has its reasons, of which reason knows nothing. And we actually know this is true. We actually know this is true, that there are things that, we say heart, but we don't mean, of course, the organ that, pumps blood through our body, but we're trying to name something that we're not quite sure what to name it, but we're aware of it. It is that part of our being that is capable of pure altruistic love. Okay, that our heart, and it's to that component of our being that God is made directly known. Directly. So that's where we need to help people, is how to experience God, how to experience the reality of the risen Christ. Within modernity, framed in empiricism, you have the idea that these things are not real. We've been taught that. This is why Paul Ricoeur, French philosopher, describes Marx, Nietzsche, and Freud as the masters of suspicion. And what they are really suspicious of, Paul Ricoeur doesn't bring this out, but I think he would agree. What they're most suspicious of is the reality of true altruistic, self-sacrificing love as an actual motivating factor for human beings. And so Marx is going to say, no, it's all about money. Nietzsche directly critiques it. He calls it slave morality. He says this idea of love, he doesn't believe it exists. He says it's just a way for the weak to manipulate the strong, slave morality. So he says, no, it's all about power. And Freud, he's going to say mostly it's all about sex. Most of us, by the way, are not persuaded by that. We go, no, you know what? I believe love is real. And then as we follow that, and this has to do with God. This has to do with our Creator. This has to do with the one who is the answer to the question, why is there something instead of nothing? You mentioned apologetics. Here's the problem. There's two kinds of apologetics. If we're talking about someone like David Bentley Hart in his book, what's the name of that book? The Experience of God.
Yep. Being,
Consciousness, and Bliss. That's a great book. It's difficult, but that's what I would consider an apologetic book. But in what we have now is we have pop apologetics, attempting to, prove the Bible scientifically. This is your Ken Ham and people like that. These are the cats that are going to be, up on Mount Ararat looking for Noah's Ark, or doing a scuba into the Dead Sea to find, Pharaoh's chariots and that kind of stuff. It's silly. Or even worse, actually, I think even worse. Lately, over the last 10 years or so, I've seen the word used really as a fancy name for tribal gatekeepers. And they are self-appointed guardians of the Christian faith. I mean, one of them, I'm not going to use their name, but one of them that's quite well known, famous apologist, lots of books. And the most recent book this author produced, somebody pointed out, they mentioned me 12 times and telling people I'm not even a Christian. I'm not a Christian. I'm a Christian. Come on, I'm a Christian. I'll quote the Apostles' Creed right now if you want me to. But I'm not there. I'm not a fundamentalist. And so they have the idea that if you're not a fundamentalist, then you're not a Christian. Well, this is the kind of stuff that will, in fact, throw people into maybe a healthy form of deconstruction. But what you have to understand is that in rejecting fundamentalism, you are not rejecting Christianity. You are rejecting a modern aberration of Christianity. And so before you just walk away from the whole thing, hold on, slow down here. You understand that the body of Christ is very wide. There's this whole ecumenical breadth and historical length to the church that maybe you ought to take a little bit of time and explore, because you might find what you're looking for in some other places. If you grew up in XYZ fundamentalist church, well, you don't have to just dismiss the whole of Christianity because that's not working for you anymore. There are, other expressions of the church.
Yeah, it's good. What are talking about that? I know that you're super ecumenical. Ryan and I also are. We're very drawn to kind of Eastern Orthodox theology, and have a love for all kinds of different Christian traditions. What are some of the things do you think, like, Protestantism or evangelicalism, like what are they missing out on? What are a couple things that you've found that you've just been like,
Well,
all right, this was missing?
Let me just riff on ecumenism a little bit. I mentioned, that founding pastor of a non-denominational church, and I don't even believe in that.
Yeah.
I mean, my defense is it's what happened. You just had to be there, and you was, well, this has happened. So, but the way I've tried to rectify anything that might be wrong with that is being deeply, passionately, intensely, intentionally ecumenical. And I look at the body of Christ like this. And I'm not saying this is not a scholarly analysis, okay? But this is just BZ's take. So take it for what it's worth. But I see the church as something like a 7-branch menorah, consisting primarily of Eastern Orthodoxy, Roman Catholicism, Anglican communion, Protestantism in its many iterations, Anabaptist, which is a different thing. That's the radical Reformation. Can't forget that. Evangelicalism, which has strands that touch all of those. And then finally, the Pentecostal charismatic expression. And I find riches in all. If you want to go find what's wrong with all of them, you can do that. You can be that kind of cynic. But that's not what I do. I try to find the best. Because I think each one of these expressions of the body of Christ are custodians of various treasures. So, Orthodox mystery, Catholic beauty, Anglican liturgy, Protestant audacity. I got 95 things I want to talk about. Nail it to there. There's something to that audacity, the capacity to challenge and change. Anabaptist peacemaking, evangelical energy. Say what you will about evangelicals, they've got energy. And then just the Pentecostal charismatic, I would just say reality, just the experience of the Spirit. I want all of that. Yes, I do think that and it's funny, I've never ever self-identified as an evangelical. It's something I've never done. I'm the Jesus movement guy, Jesus freak, with charismatic leanings. My relationship with Orthodoxy and Catholicism is very strong. I think of them as the grandparents, so you don't have to agree with your grandparents, but when you go to the family reunion, you have to respect them, right? You can't just show up at the family reunion and start making fun of grandma and grandpa. No, you don't do that, because there's no accounting for you without them. And so without the Orthodox and Catholic history, we don't exist. And I get asked almost every week, why I haven't converted to one or the other. How come I'm not Orthodox or Catholic? And I said, well, because I'm not. I'm not. That's not what I am. Yeah. And I don't feel any particular need to actually convert to a particular expression, but I fellowship with them as much as they'll allow. And I told you, I just got done leading I was the retreat director for a monastery of Benedictine nuns. So that gives you an idea that, they've become comfortable with me. And I've spoken at Orthodox conferences and on it goes. I think much of what is impoverished within American evangelicalism could be enriched if they would read outside of their little narrow spectrum. My latest binge, I'm pretty much done with it like last year, but I read a whole bunch of Sergius Bulgakov. He was a Russian Orthodox theologian that was active, let's say, mostly from about 1920 to 1945 is his real active period. He was in Paris, because after the Bolshevik Revolution, he had to leave Russia. But I've read a lot of Catholic theology, a lot of Orthodox theology, a fair amount of Anglican theology, and on it goes. And I think it's done nothing but enrich me. So I'm a big proponent. And part of it is, I think I'm always a little bit insecure about being non-denominational. It's not something I boast about. It's just what happens. I'm gonna, you don't yell at an orphan for being an orphan. What's wrong with you? I'm an orphan, And then someone said, well, we'll adopt you. And they try to get me to join their denomination, but I don't think, that's what Jesus is calling me to do. So I just travel through these and I can worship with the Orthodox. I can worship with the Catholics, and I do. I'm comfortable there, and I just try to be respectful, and I try to find what is, our common ground. And I hate that thing. I don't even like that phrase because it makes it sound like, that I'm actually somehow adversarial, and now, but we find common. No, I'm not adversarial. I could imagine myself being I could imagine myself being Orthodox Catholic, easily Anglican. Sometimes when people say describe Word of Life Church, I don't really know what we are, but I'll say, imagine like rock and roll Anglican.
Yeah.
I think that's kind of what we
Yeah.
are. So one of the best things I've done over the last 20 years is get out of my little silo. If you're in a big cathedral, and think of these, especially in Europe, these great cathedrals, they have chapels, on the sides. And people we can confuse our own particular chapel for the whole cathedral. And then in some forms of very, low church Protestantism, it's like we've confused our broom closet for the whole cathedral, and no, there's a whole beautiful, I know it's easy. I know it's easy to be critical of the church. Good. I know that. And I could do it as well as anybody. But I do want to remind you something that Rene Girard said. And Rene Girard said, Voltaire and his successors only criticize Christianity with Christianity. The most vehement, vitriolic critics of Christianity, their essential argument is this: Christianity is not Christian enough. To which we say, pray for us. I accept that. So I guess part of what I'm saying, though, is it's easy just to be dismissive and critical of the church. And if you want to find that which is ugly, that which is, thin, that which is repellent, you can find that. But there's also beauty there. There really is. And so that's what I go looking for, and that's what I find, and that's part of what makes me happy.
So you've used that word beauty a couple times, and I find it ironic because years ago, I think it was, I don't know, 2010, 2012, something like that, you came out with that book, Beauty Will Save the World. And out of all your works, I would probably say that is the one that has influenced Matt and I the most. And we haven't even known each other really that long, but it influenced us both kind of equally at the same time, a few years after you wrote it, to the term that we kind of, you don't know this about me, but I'm not really a big fan of any big churches. I kind of think the recipe we were given looked more like 70 or a couple hundred, than the hundreds and thousands it's turned into. But still, I believe that the beauty of the church looks best in kind of a community, tribal look. And so Matt and I are part of like just a really small, we call it a micro church, because we're both involved in the same church. It's a bigger church as well, but we kind of live out life with this smaller pocket of people. And I just can't tell you how many times people come up very jealous of that, that we raise each other's kids. We're, always off on these crazy vacations and, everything else. And it's alluring to most people that are stuck in the muck of the world that they're in. And I'm an Old Testament guy, and I would kind of go with the first 2 pages or first 2 chapters of the Bible, get it right, and the last 2 chapters, and everything in the middle is mucked up. And I think you even have a chapter out of Eden or something like that kind of goes with that, but we're supposed to be kind of like looking good, where this should be alluring to the rest of the world. It should look beautiful, and it doesn't. And I kind of consider you a master of that conversation. So divulge a little bit about your thoughts there.
The Greek philosophers spoke of, especially Plato and Plotinus, they spoke of what we call the transcendentals, the good, the true, and the beautiful. And these are attributes that are desired in and of themselves for themselves. In other words, let's say it this way. We want the true because it's true. It doesn't have to serve some other purpose. We want the good because it's good. We want the beautiful simply because it's beautiful. Later, church fathers say, Plato, Plotinus, they're onto something here. And what they are identifying as what we call the transcendentals are actually attributes of God. God is the good, the true, and the beautiful. Now, there then comes along with that a whole venerable history of the church engaging with these, at least the first two. So we have Christian apologetics, which we have mentioned rather dismissively thus far, but let me say something good about it. At its best, Christian apologetics is a defense of the truth as revealed in Christ, right? What is truth? Jesus Christ is truth. Okay, what the good? We have this history of Christian ethics. Okay, so that is an attempt to define the good in the light of Christ. Christian ethics. I mean, think about people like Stanley Hauerwas, who that's kind of his area. With the beautiful, though, an attempt at Christian aesthetics, we've been hit and miss. Sometimes the church has excelled at that. Other times the church, especially in the Protestant world, has dismissed beauty as mere adornment. And so it's dismissed. But here in the present moment that we have, here's the thing about beauty. Beauty's hard to define, but we know it when we see it. And it has to do with form, whether it's painting, poetry, song, sculpture, clearly, the proportions, whether we're talking about notes of the music or the skillful arrangement of words and poetry, it has to do with form. And the form of Christian beauty ultimately is paradoxically the crucifix. Okay, that's our form. So our posture in the world should resemble that. Okay, it's very easy for Christians to be present in the world, unfortunately, with the posture of the pointing finger of accusation, or the wagging finger of scolding, or the furrowed brow of anger, clenched fist of protest. No, we are to emulate the beauty of Christ in his crucifixion, offering the world unconditional forgiveness. So at our present moment, if all we do is lean into the good and the true, which I'm for, I mean, I believe in it, but I'll say it this way: if we take our stand in the marketplace of ideas in 21st century America and say, hey, everybody, we have absolute truth and we know what's good for you, and we meet at 10 o'clock on Sunday mornings. That's going to be met at best with absolute dismissiveness, or worse. So that does leave that third transcendental of beauty. And here's the thing about beauty: has a way of sneaking past our defenses. Cervantes says it is the prerogative and charm of beauty to win hearts. You know, beauty can attract us even if we don't want to be attracted. And so what if the church could enact beauty in a way that people outside the church would say, well, you know, I'm not a Christian and I don't believe what they believe, but you have to admit that's beautiful. Mm-hmm. That's beautiful. And so you've said some kind things about my book, Beauty Will Save the World. It's the book that I aspire to. It's the book of my own that I feel like, I need to read that book again.
Right.
And
I think Matt just read it again, didn't you, Matt?
Yeah, we were on a 2-week road trip with the family, and I listened to the audiobook when we were driving to the Smoky Mountains.
Yeah. So I think it's probably at our current moment, it's about the only way forward is for us to analyze what we do as a church, asking the third question. Not merely is it good and is it true? I think church is using, is this a good thing to do? Is this true? Is this good? Is this true? I think we have to ask the third question, is it beautiful?
Yeah.
And
Sure.
and not in our eyes. Will this be beautiful in the eyes of people outside our church?
Yeah.
Really, I do think that's the way forward. And here's the thing about beauty. I trust my aesthetic sense probably ultimately more than I do my rational mind. I try to be rational. I try to be a clear thinker, but I actually probably trust my aesthetic senses more. Here's a famous little thing. Fyodor Dostoevsky, who's been a big influence in my life, in a letter to his brother said, if it should be shown to me, proved to me mathematically, I like that he used that word, mathematically, if it were proved to me mathematically that Christ is outside the truth and truth is outside of Christ, I would rather remain with Christ than with the truth. Hold on, just hold on. Simone Weil didn't like that. She didn't like that. And I respect Simone Weil, but I think I understand what Dostoevsky, and I agree with him actually. I don't believe there's any contradiction between the beauty and truth of Christ. That I don't believe for a second. I don't think Dostoevsky did either. I think really what he's getting at is there are some things that are too beautiful not to be true. And, Voltaire famously said, if God did not exist, we would have to invent him. To which I would say to Voltaire, well, I would say two things. First thing I would say is, without God, there'd be no atheists. And then the second thing I would say is, if Jesus Christ never existed, we would never have dreamed him up. I mean, that life is so alluring, so attractive, so beautiful that it seems to, in fact, invite us into a transcendent world. And so I can aspire to things that I know that I'm not going to perfectly live out, but really I do want to keep leaning into that. But is it beautiful? But is it beautiful? Lord, make my life beautiful. I don't mean, I don't mean attractive. I don't mean Instagram beautiful. I mean something that is truly the beauty of a well-formed and well-lived life. That's what I want to do. That's what I aspire to. And I know I keep missing the mark, but I keep pressing on as well.
Yeah. So good. A couple last questions, I guess, before we leave you be, because we've taken up a lot of your time and we so appreciate you coming on and talking with us. You mentioned a sermon a while back, one I really liked was you're talking about future leaders in the church, and they said that the church needed mystics or nothing at all. What did you mean by that? And like, what does the church need in future leaders? What's the important things?
Yeah, that's a line from who's the Catholic theologian that said that? Just left me here for a moment. Perhaps it'll come to me.
Can't remember off the top of my head either.
In 1971, it's going to just bug me. It's just a podcast, right? So I can take my time.
Yeah. Take your time.
Okay.
We're good.
A mystic or nothing at all. Page 125. It's just bugging me that I can't think of this guy's name. It's right on the tip of my tongue. Karl Rahner.
Okay.
Rahner.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
The devout Christian of the future will either be a mystic, one who has experienced something, or he will cease to be anything at all. Karl Rahner said that in 1971 in the context, by the way, of the charismatic Catholic movement. Well, what Karl Rahner called the future in 1971 is what we call now. And we have arrived at that point where the Christian is going to be a mystic, that is, someone who has experienced something, or they will in fact cease to be nothing at all. People are not going to remain Christian out of just dogged allegiance to a tradition. And they're not going to be they're not going to be persuaded by somebody else's apologetic argument. They are going to have had their own experience with God. And this is what the human spirit is actually capable of. All right. So humans are unique. You think about all that exists. Okay. Here's a rock. It has being. Here's a plant. It has life. It has being and life. Here's a cat. It has being and life and awareness. But when you cross the threshold into the human, and I'm not saying this is a hard line, there may be a spectrum here, but certainly by the time you arrive at human, we are not only have being and life and awareness, we are aware of our awareness. We are self-conscious, which is a phenomenon that has not yet been explained scientifically. It's interesting that you can look at the brain all day long, but it doesn't seem to. How do we arrive at this point of self-awareness, this awareness of our awareness? Well, this capacity for self-awareness is also the capacity for God awareness, but it comes at the price of death awareness, because then we're also aware of our own finite existence, and then we have to deal with that in some way. And Christians, we have confessed and believe that the primary thing that Jesus saves us from is death. There's all the other things, but I mean, ultimately, the Anastasis icon in the Eastern Church of Christ descending into Hades and the gates of hell falling in the form of a cross beneath his feet, and the broken, shattered locks and chains, and he's taking hold of an old man and an old woman. This is Adam and Eve, representing the whole of humanity. Adam, human, and Eva, life, and pulling them up out of the grave. So that's beautiful, but that's experienced through cultivating a heart that is open to the things of God, and that's prayer school. That's learning contemplative prayer. That's what I think is the most important thing I do as a pastor. In fact, I won't say think. I'll be definitive on this. I've been a pastor for almost 42 years, officially, longer unofficially. And I can say the most helpful thing I do is teach people how to pray. And it took me a long time to learn how to pray well. It took me a long time. And then even then, when I finally did, I think it was just a gracious act of the Holy Spirit that sort of, by intuition, I began to find out really how to pray, using some prayer books and things like that. It's a long story. I won't tell it all. But what was interesting was I didn't realize what a gift that was. I just thought, okay, I've learned how to pray well. And I say that just very objectively, learn how to pray well. And it changed my life. Again, I know it sounds like hyperbole, but sometimes it's just what the truth is. But I'd never thought about teaching it. It just, I don't know. I don't know why. I never thought about that. But the team that I'd lead the church with, they began to notice the changes in me. And they said, yeah, you seem, filled with peace, and you seem different. And what's going on? I said, well, I think it's the way I pray. And they said, well, can you teach us? I said, well, I suppose I can. I can just tell you what I do anyway. And it'll take me about an hour. And so we set up an hour to do this. And I realized, oh my goodness, I can't tell you in an hour. It's going to take more like 3 or 4 or 5 hours. And so that was the first time I taught somebody, was just our leadership team. But then the church heard about it, and people started asking me. And at first I would keep it real small. We'd have like little small groups, but there was too much interest. And one thing led to another. Now I've kind of refined it so that it's I present prayer school in 3 90-minute sessions, and I've done it 94 times.
Yeah.
I mean, literally
I've
94
been to
times.
2 of them. I've been to 2 of them.
And
I've got your
that's
your
That's
thing right here.
Which
And
the
my
interesting thing is
Common
that
Book
was
Prayer.
never printed up until I started teaching it, because I had it all memorized, and it sort of just happened to me organically over about maybe a year and a half. After about a year and a half, it kind of settled into that, and Well, anyway, I don't even remember what we were talking about. We were talking about the Christian of the future will be a mystic. That is, and that doesn't mean an occultist, if somebody's alarmed by the word. It's just, Christian mysticism simply means a direct encounter with the divine. So a Christian mystic is someone who aspires to and at some level attains a direct encounter with God, which is what, I mean, the whole of Scripture sets that forth as normative. I mean, really, quite literally, the whole Bible is bearing witness to the fact that you can experience God. And some of that can be, some of that's sovereign, but a lot of it is developing our own capacity to be aware of what God is saying and doing in our midst and in our own life. And so just becoming attuned to the work of grace in our life, that's the first steps toward being what might be called a Christian mystic. But I like Karl Rahner. He wrote a book called Everyday Mystics, and he's trying to, say, look, this isn't just the purview of, Julian of Norwich or John of the Cross or Teresa of Avila. This can be, Brian of St. Joe or just anybody. You can work towards forming your heart in such a way that you are aware of what has always been there. And that's God's loving, caring presence. So in prayer school, I say all the time, the primary purpose of prayer is not to get God to do what we think God ought to do, but to be properly formed toward that end. We cannot count on ourselves, depend on ourselves, trust on ourselves to do all of our own praying. And so we need some wise, well-crafted, church-vetted, time-tested prayers that can form us. And then once we're formed, what's happened is we are arriving at a place where we have the potential to experience God in a daily way. And those are the kind of people that are going to remain Christian, not people that just have dogged allegiance to a tradition or are browbeaten or threatened with hell or something like that. No. It's going to be those that have a direct experience with the God revealed in Jesus Christ. That's who's going to remain a Christian. And that's available to everybody.
That's a pretty good conclusion to this conversation,
Okay.
I might say, as if you planned that or something. So how can people get more Brian Zahnd? I mean, I think you just came out with The Anticipated Christ. Was that your latest one? And,
yeah, I have a book that is finished. It's finished, and it comes out in February 6th. The Wood Between the Worlds, A Poetic Theology of the Cross. All that remains is for the audiobook. I'm going to read that book. So
you are a theologian now.
I'm a poet. No, that's I'm not even a poet, but whatever. It is a poetic theology of the cross, as opposed to an academic theology of the cross. Yeah. That's how I would juxtaposition that. Well, you can find me because I have an unusual name. I've not found another Brian Zahnd out there. There might be, but I don't think so. So if you just Google Brian Zahnd, you'll find I'm pretty active on what used to be called the platform formerly known as Twitter. We'll see what happens there. Instagram, a little bit on Facebook. I mean, I have it and I put stuff out there. I don't really engage there. I have a blog. Well, podcasts killed the blog, so and you'll find my books. Now you'll find other things too. You'll find all my sermons are on YouTube. You will also find my critics on YouTube telling you that I'm not a Christian, but I am. So just Google Brian Zahnd and you'll find everything.
Great. Thank you so much for coming on. We've loved this conversation.
Thank you.
Really love your ministry. You've been an encouragement to Ryan and I and so many other people. And so we just pray that the Lord bless you and keep you. And thanks for joining us on Expedition 44.
Thank you.